Good evening, and welcome to this week's Black Mental Health is Black Health. I am your host, Bronwyn Lucas, and I'm excited to be with you again today. Our topic today is Juneteenth, something we celebrated earlier this week. This is a sort of a history lesson tonight. I'm going back to the show's original roots, and just be me sharing some information with you tonight. Hopefully, you'll glean some information, challenge your thinking, um, and just overall enhance who you are. That's our goal. If you've never been here before, let me tell you, we start every show with some deep breathing. Why? A few deep breaths can cleanse your mind, allow you to think more clearly, feel a little better. So that's why we're here, and that's what we're here to do. So here's how we do it. If you've not done it before, put your hands lightly on your stomach. And when I say breathe in, I'm going to count to four, and you will breathe in slowly as I'm counting slowly. And I'll say breathe out, or I'll say exhale, and you'll breathe out slowly. We'll do that for two times. And on the third breath, I'm going to say hold it for four. You breathe in, hold for four, and breathe out. Let's get ready. Breathe in, two, three, four, out, two, three, four, in, two, three, four, out, two, three, four, in, two, three, four, hold, two, three, four, and out, two, three, four. A moment to just woosah and breathe. Well, as I said, tonight is all about Juneteenth. What is it? Why in the world should we celebrate it? Should we celebrate it? The pros, the cons, the good, the bad, the ugly. So we will be talking about that tonight. So first, I want to talk about just what is Juneteenth. Because some people you will find know, some people you don't. I will share some comments later on that people have said about what they think about Juneteenth and where it is and what it is. So we'll get a chance to get into all of that. But I'm going to give you, like I said, a little history lesson. So, in general, Juneteenth is a celebration of the day that the enslaved in Texas found out they were free. Now, freedom came a year and a half earlier, but in Texas, it took 18 months to get here. Some say that it was because the messengers that were sent here were killed. Others say it was that they wanted to get one more harvest in before they let the slaves go free. Um, Either way, it took a year and a half for freedom to come to Texas. Some say it's worth celebrating, others say it's not. So we're just going to kind of look at that. But first, let's just talk about that time of freedom. And yes, I say air quotes freedom. Um, Let me read to you what was actually read. It's pretty short. It was called General Order Number 3. This is what was read on June 19th, 1865. The people are informed in accordance with the proclamation of the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between the former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them, becoming employer and hired labor. The freed are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. That's the entire General Order Number 3 that was read on that day in 1865. When I read it and thought about it, let's look at a few statements. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. Equality. Is that something we've achieved yet in terms of how we are seen in this country as the descendants of the enslaved? And it said that they would become employer and hired laborer. Just hearing that. So you're going to send a piece of paper, and I'm going to now pay people that I have abused, beaten, and worked for me free. That's what the law said. But then it also went on to say the freed are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. Doubt very seriously how much the enslaved, saw the plantation as their home and wanted to stay there. Many left, many stayed because they didn't have a place to go. Many left because they wanted to go in search of family members who were sold away. Some stayed, some left. So, to get around the idea of paying them for their labor and making the formerly enslaved hired labor, that's when the sharecropper system began. That was the roots of that. Where okay, you can work, but you got to pay for your place to stay. You got to do this. You got to do this. So you're working, but you're not really making any money at it. You may end up owing the massa money. So even though the document was read and freedom was granted, it wasn't automatic. Yes, they were automatically free, but things did not automatically change. Why celebrate? Because even though all of the life situations didn't automatically change, that period of enslavement was legally over. And that is why celebration occurred. Now, like I told you, back a year and a half earlier was when the Emancipation Proclamation was written, read, and slaves are now no longer enslaved. However, it was a presidential edict, and it really wasn't, it didn't include all states. So let's look at what the Emancipation Proclamation itself did. That was, what led to General Order Number 3. The proclamation affected only 10 states, and they were individually named in it. And that was South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, and North Carolina. These were the only states that were truly impacted by the verbiage in the Emancipation Proclamation. Texas just got it later, and that was a general order freeing the slaves in those states. The states that were not included were already Union states, so it only freed the slaves in the South. The Union states, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky, were not included. They weren't slave states, so they weren't included. Part of this was to get to have more fighting in the Union Army. That was a big part of it. It decreed that all freed slaves could enlist in the Union Army, thereby increasing the Union's available manpower. So it wasn't necessarily this altruistic act. They were trying to save the Union. So now you're free, you can come and fight. And you're fighting for your freedom because that's a big part of what it was about, but it increased the manpower. And it was a step toward abolishing slavery and conferring citizenship among upon the ex-enslaved. It didn't actually outlaw slavery, but it set the groundwork. It wasn't really until the 13th Amendment that slavery was fully abolished in all states. It was not until the 14th Amendment until citizenship was granted. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal civil and legal rights to African Americans and enslaved people who had been emancipated after the Civil War. So even right after the Civil War, until the 14th Amendment, they were free, but you still didn't have citizenship until the 14th Amendment made it clear. And the 15th Amendment gave African American men, the formerly enslaved, the right to vote, because women still could vote. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are very important in understanding just the role of road to freedom. And so it's more than just Juneteenth. So as we talk about it, I said tonight is, like I said, a history lesson in looking at our history. Some people don't want to look at it, and we need to let it go. And that is what you're seeing in so many of the schools, because, oh, it's going to hurt little Johnny and Becky's feelings if they know this. It's the truth. And if we don't learn our truth, we may repeat our truth. We may repeat history, rather, and we don't want to do that. So that is why I'm here talking about it. But I want to drop a few little tidbits just about during that time of enslavement and what it might have looked like here in Texas. It was the same as everywhere else. I was reading somewhere where there was a law in Texas. You were prohibited from killing one of your enslaved Africans, but you were not prohibited from beating them and beating them to near death. But wow, you couldn't kill them. Thought that was interesting. I read that in one thing. So I'll be dropping different little tidbits because I'm a bit of a history nerd. I like to study history, not just for the sake of studying history, but understanding where we have come from, to be able to share that and make sure we're not going back. And wow, that's a whole nother show talking about where are we going forward or backwards, not in terms of us, but in terms of laws. But some other tidbits about Texans and the period of enslavement. We know a lot about the Underground Railroad that went north to Canada. In Texas, however, the enslaved did not escape to Canada typically. We were a little further away. They escaped to Mexico. And in Texas, the Quakers were also instrumental in helping slaves get to Mexico. One of the things that would happen, you might see if it were a Quaker family and the slaves were trying to get away, they might see different quilts hanging out like they were airing out. Well, really, those quilts and those had messages in them. It might be, this is a safe house, or you can come here. They were allowed to go to different Quaker homes and change clothes because you did not want to go into freedom in your old slave clothes. So you could go clean up and move into Mexico. The same river that we're fighting about people crossing into this country was a river where slaves were going out of to go into Mexico. And in Mexico, they could have their freedom. Many of them moved deep into Mexico, didn't want to just stop at the border because that was too close. So moved deep into Mexico and found freedom, spoke Spanish, and became citizens of Mexico, and their descendants are there. And that is maybe part of the reason you see such a variation in color of those who come from Mexico, from the roots of those who became Mexican citizens and spent their life in Mexico and never came back. Why would you want to come back? So just some tidbits just about that time that I find that people don't even know, people are not aware of. So going back to just Juneteenth and looking at that time, as I said, it was a time when the enslaved were set free. It was later. Some will argue, including myself, we need to really look at what freedom is and how we're treated in this country and how the laws are changing and what is going on now in this country. What does it look like? But back to just Juneteenth itself. Why was it first celebrated? What did some of the first celebrations look like? Well, obviously, the first one was on that day on June 19th in 1865, where they were truly celebrating. Now, stop and think about it. When I thought about this, yes, the decree was read in Galveston on that day, on June 19th. They didn't have social media. They didn't have television. They didn't have radio. So it still took a minute to get throughout Texas because everything was on horseback. Everything was on foot. So in the southern end of Texas, yes, in southeast Texas, they got the word first. And as I was studying for this, I was, or just researching rather, I was like, wonder how long did it take to get to other parts of Texas, the news? Because we always think about that's the day the Texans found out they were free, the enslaving Texans. But I wonder, as I study this, how long did it take the rest of Texas to find out? I don't have an answer to that one. But it was one of those things that make you say, And I had to stop and think. I wonder how much longer did it take in other parts. I just don't know. But that was probably the first celebration. And then um, annually, those who were formerly enslaved wanted to celebrate. There were some of the first celebrations, of course, many were still on the plantations the next year. Because as it said, even the decree stated you should stay in your current home and work for wages. Well, some felt they didn't have a place to go and stay. Many did move to the north to migrate away. But those who were here wanted to celebrate. On some former plantations, they were allowed to, some they were not. As time went on, the celebrations began. The celebrations continued. Two that were notable was in 1872, a group of African American ministers and businessmen in Houston um, bought some land. Now, this is really amazing because they bought land and they purchased it for $1,000. It was then called, and it's still called, Emancipation Park. One of the reasons they bought this land, it was intended to hold the city's annual Juneteenth celebration. That is why, and that park still stands today. It's been redone in the last decade, but Emancipation Park is still exists. There were four ministers, and I had their four names, and I have forgotten them. I know them and know them well, and can't think of them. I will think of them before we end and let you know the names of those who were, instrumental. But here's the thing about them: they put together $1,000, which, if you think about it, these were former slaves. So this was not a generation removed. This was right out of slavery. And they put together $1,000, which is equivalent today to about, I looked it up. It's probably like about $300,000 today. So, think about that. These were formerly enslaved, and they put together that much money to buy land for the purpose, and it was for the purpose of having these celebrations. Wow, amazing that they put that together. Um, and like I say, the land still stands there. And for a long time, it is one of the oldest celebrations of freedom in this country. It's been ongoing, that hasn't stopped. Another was in Mahia, Texas. That celebration started also in the 1800s. Mahia is closer to Central Texas. And later, the Booker T. Washington Park was named for that site, and they began celebrating in 1898. So when we look at Juneteenth as a celebration, it was started by the former enslaved because they were obviously ecstatic about their freedom and wanted to celebrate. And more than just being ecstatic about their freedom, it was a way of reminding everybody, look at where we've come from. And as I said, these celebrations started shortly after the freedom. The one in Houston, the one in Mahia, and others throughout the state of Texas were just a way of proclaiming their freedom, and it was a way of saying, oh no, we're going to remember. And it was a way to show the white folks, we ain't going back. As I read this, we're not going back. Because they had their freedom in some ways and they didn't. You still had those who were, when these celebrations first started, who were still living on the plantations. As I said, they may have been sharecroppers, may have been working, but not for real pay, as the decree said. So yeah, I looked it up. I did find a note that Land in Houston was purchased for $1,000, and it would be worth $38,000 today. What they would have to pay. So think about those who were formerly enslaved were able to raise that much money. Well, there were ministers, there were businessmen, and they, reached their congregations, they reached the people they knew, and they put together that much money. It is amazing what we can do when we need to and want to. And it was for that reason. Um, so I wanted to look at what about this thing called Juneteenth? I asked some different people, I just sent some texts out, hey, what do you know about Juneteenth? Those who were not born in Texas, many didn't know until recently. One person stated, I always wonder what rock we lived under because it was not a thing in Flint, Michigan. Uh, or my family just worked all the time and never participated because I didn't learn about it until I moved to Cincinnati, Ohio as an adult. I know when I lived in Kentucky, and that was in the early 2000s, there were people who had never heard of it. And back at that time, it was just becoming where it was being more and more of a national celebration. Well, how did it get to be this national celebration? Right after it was read, the formerly enslaved were heading north. And they took that message with them and began to celebrate. So you had pockets all across the country who were celebrating um, at that time, a year later, the next year, the next year, the next year. They were celebrating because they moved from Texas. And so people were like, y'all late. But it became representative of the end of slavery in America. They were the last to get the news, so thus now it's really over. We have really ended it. And we're going to talk in a little bit about what that means. But it was officially ended. And that is how the celebrations were sprinkled throughout different parts of the country. People taking that with them, wanting to celebrate, wanting to carry it on. But there are those who feel this isn't something we should celebrate. And now I have, my views have changed over time. I can remember when I was much younger, and I'm going to read a comment by someone, but I can remember when I was a child, much younger, because my family has always celebrated and known about Juneteenth. We knew about it as a child from a historical perspective, from understanding it. So when I was younger, I thought, why in Texas is just backwards? Why in the world are we celebrating that we found out a year late? We celebrating that we late, and that our ancestors in Texas were held in bondage longer than they need to. Is that something to celebrate? I don't think so. That's how I felt. Um, as I'll share this comment, then I'll tell you how I've changed a little bit. This is another comment. As an adult, the Slavery Museum, Dr. King sculpture, and finally, making Juneteenth a holiday continues to connect us to slavery and struggle rather than triumph. When memorials are erected, ask yourself, is it a memorial of triumph or conquering? It depends on the owner of the land. Black folks don't own this country, so white folks are owners by theft. So, would an owner erect a monument to his defeat or who he defeated? Will they consider someone they defeated a hero? As for Juneteenth, as an adult, federal recognition of the day is a slap in the face. The government and financial system that benefited from our free labor takes a day off in memory of us working 2 extra years. They got us celebrating them telling us 2 years late. When will we get tired of naming monuments, idols, in place of real legislation and reparations owed to us? For that, I'm out. And that is not an only view. Some of the things I agree with, But I look at one of the reasons I say I think it needs to continue to be celebrated is because right now in a great country of America, we see our history being eradicated. We see books about us, books that are truth about us being taken out of schools one by one or in droves. In the state of Texas, the word slavery doesn't appear in the history books, indentured servants and other servitude, but taking away the designation of slavery, that's diminishing that time period. So I don't see it so much as a monument to our defeat, but I think we should take a page from the Jewish people who state never let them forget. They're not going to forget their history. That what happened with Hitler and all of that. We do not need to forget because when we forget our history can repeat itself. And I know you're like, well, we would never be enslaved again like that. We have modern slavery. It's called the prison system. The school to prison pipeline, all part of modern slavery. When you look at how voting rights are being rolled back, we need to understand what we've overcome and what we've gone through so we don't go back and repeat the same things over and over again. So it's important to know our history. One of the benefits I see to having it as a holiday, and I could say at first I was like, is that it is a way to put it out there. So I think our role though is to not let it just be a holiday, not let it just be a day off. Let it be a time of education. Let it be a time where we're saying, yes, this is what happened in this country. So, the celebrations did begin as literally that. It's like a block party. There was barbecue, there was this, there was that, there was all that we wanted to do. There was good music and celebration. However, today, as we celebrate, I don't think it needs to just be a parade. It doesn't just need to be a music festival. It needs to be a time of education, especially since education is being eroded in not just in Texas, throughout this country. We see that education for our children is being eroded. So I think it's a time where we can say, this is really what happened. Let me tell the story. We need to continue the story and continue the story and continue the story so that our real history is not erased by whitewashed, watered down lies that don't even admit that there was a time in this country when people were enslaved, a time in this country where because of the color of your skin and the melanin in your skin, you are only considered three-fourths a person, a person. And we need to, a three-fifths a person. I know I had the fraction wrong. We were only considered three-fifths a person, and we were only considered three-fifths a person. So when they did the census, the states would have more to count on, but it couldn't call you a whole person because how could you enslave a whole person? How could you enslave a human being and treat them this way? We never need to let it die out. We need to teach our children. It's not going to happen in the schools. We need to teach our children, our grandchildren, our neighbors, our nieces, our nephews, not just our children, our adults who don't know. So we need to reclaim our history. We need to understand, and we are more than the enslaved. Let me say that. I am not saying that, oh, we need to hold on to that because that's who we were and that's where we come from. We are so much more than that. We need to also teach that our history, our being, did not begin in slavery. We come from kings and queens out of Africa. We were taken. We need to understand what the Middle Passage was. We need to understand that, yes, our ancestors sold us into slavery, but the slavery they were selling us to, this was a practice that existed long before chattel slavery of America, was not what they were doing. It wasn't until the Europeans came and raped the land and took the people. Um, but we need to understand all of this in context. And Juneteenth can be a time where we take it and we understand the context of coming from kings and queens in Africa to the enslaved to where we are now and everything that comes in between. So I think it can be a point of triumph, and not just because we've overcome, but we have a lot of overcoming to continue to do. And we use it as that time. We use it as a time to combat even some of the negative stereotypes that we have. One of them, I thought I would, like I said, I'm dropping tidbits tonight. And I remember when I found this out a few years ago. What is the deal with black folk and watermelon? Why is it such a negative stereotype? Watermelon is a fruit and we eat it. What is the deal about fried chicken and black people? Is white people eat it? What is a negative stereotype about it? Where did it begin? You may know this, but maybe you'll share it with somebody who didn't know. It all comes back to economics. Shortly after, during the time of Reconstruction and after slavery, and um, blacks who the formerly enslaved who were used to cooking would sell food to those on the trains. They couldn't ride the train, but they can go make some money off the folks riding the trains, and would sell chicken was one of the things they could do. Fried chicken, it would last and sell it, and so they were getting quite good at it and amassing some wealth and selling food because people on the trains needed food. And well, if you don't want someone to do well, you figure out what they're doing and you make it negative. And that is where part of that stereotype came of they were just chicken eating, they were watermelon eating because they were growing and selling watermelon and making money at it. And it became a way, so you would begin to see the old minstrel pictures of someone in blackface eating watermelon, and it had this negative stereotype. Watermelon was considered the food of the lazy. And if you were sitting eating it, it meant because you were too lazy and you had too much idle time on your hands. And so the association of being lazy and lazy food and idle came to be associated with African Americans. Now remember, we were selling and growing watermelon. We knew how to grow it and knew how to grow it well. And we were selling it and making money. Again, another way. So we weren't just eating it, we were selling it and making money at it. So, we know about Tulsa and everything that happened with that. And we're really finding, it's even become something that happened years ago that has become to the forefront. But that is just one example of how, whenever as a people we are making money, we are um, becoming successful, it's going to get shut down and turned against us. So as we were making money with the watermelon, growing it, selling it, we're gonna let them do it, but we're not gonna let them eat it. Then they're gonna stop selling it themselves. It's going to have a negative connotation. So not only will you not want to eat it, you don't want to grow it because you don't want to be associated with anything that is considered lazy, shiftless, any of the negative connotations. So then you had the negative images that were out there. So why would you want to be a part of those negative images? You don't. So what do? You simply stop, and then they can continue with the um, negative energy that's put out there toward that, and then you don't want it. So as we look at why I say we should, continue to maybe deal with Juneteenth, but from a point of education, letting our young people, our children, our old people who don't know our history, understand about the enslaved going to Mexico, the role of the Quakers in that, what Texas really looks like, and how different people groups in Texas managed slavery. How the role of slavery in the Alamo. We talked about that a while back on another show. Um, and I'll just throw it out. So I'm going to throw some tidbits out for you to even think about the role of slavery in the Alamo, as there were differences in Mexico and Texas in their views. As I stated, the enslaved went to Mexico because they were free there, because the Mexicans, didn't have a problem with it, didn't have a problem with Africans, and were opposed to slavery. And that was actually one of the things that they were, um, it was an issue in what they were fighting about in the Alamo. You don't hear about that, but yes, that was one of the differences and things that um, they were at odds with. So again, there's so much we don't know. I wanted to just drop a few tidbits about Juneteenth. There was a comment that I wanted to make at the end of when I read General Granger's what he read on that day. The last line said, let me find it. It said that they are informed that they will not be allowed to collect military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere, meaning there on the plantation or anywhere else you went, you could not be involved in idleness. Well, there were different black codes that were written after Reconstruction, and if you were the former enslaved or the descendants of enslaved, you could be jailed for just standing outside, literally, because where are you working, where are you going, and if you didn't answer, that was reason to take you in. What does that look like today? Remember stop and frisk in New York, driving while black, driving while shopping. I mean, shopping, being in Central Park, being in a store, doing all of these things, and you are just stopped, or someone calls the police because you're there. Wow, the black codes don't exist anymore? Not in writing. But if we don't know our history, it begins to repeat, and we don't know and understand where it's coming from. We don't understand how deeply it's embedded in everything that we're saying and doing. So, yes, we've got to know more of our history. As someone said in the chat, not much has changed. No, not enough has changed. And if we don't know it, we're repeating it over and over. So, yes, we've got to know where we come from, understand. We need to know for ourselves, what is Reconstruction? What were the black codes that came after? What is Jim Crow? What really happened in the Montgomery boycott? How many bombs were going off in Birmingham? Why was it called Birmingham? What happened in your state with regard to the history of African descendants in your state? Every state has its own history. I make it a point when I move to a place to find out what was our history here. Recently, earlier this year, was able to find out the history of African Americans in Arlington, Texas. Rich history, but we need to know our history. We need to know where it is so we are not repeating it. As we see voting rights being eroded, we're seeing human rights being eroded. We need to understand our history. Are we more than descendants of enslaved? Yes, we are. However, are we descendants of enslaved? Yes, we are. So know our history, understand our history, so we don't repeat our history. Know our history, understand our history, so others aren't perpetuating the same things against us. Know our history, understand our history, so that we can see, wow, not much has changed. It's maybe the same thing with a different hat on it, and we need to eradicate it. We need to change it. So, as I said, tonight was about a history lesson of understanding, just a little. Hopefully, I piqued interest in understanding our history, whether you know it or not. Even if you are well versed in history, man, get out there and share it with others. If you're not, if anything on here was new to you, go study, go look at it. Challenge me, go look at it. Is she right? Did we really escape to Mexico? Um, is she right that that's what order number two said? Is she right that Emancipation Proclamation didn't include all the states that were in the state? Go look for yourself. Know your history so we won't repeat it. I like to always end the show with a call to action. And that is something you can do as a result of hearing the show today. So, my first point is know your history, as I've said over and over and over tonight. Know your history, love your history. Are we greater than being just descendants of enslaved? Yes, we are. We are that and so much more. But embrace it, it's part of our history. There are parts of your personal family history you like to sweep under the rug, but it's still who you are. So it's part of who we are. Understand it, embrace it. It's not all of who we are, but it is. So embrace our history. The second call to action is to share our history with someone else. We as a people have to hold on, and we as a people have to pass it on to others. So pass no history. What number three, what is your family history? As we are more than just the descendants of the enslaved, can you go back that far in your family? Can you take it back to where they were enslaved? If not, tell your children, your grandchildren, nieces, nephews about your family history. The good, the bad, the ugly. It's your history. Know your personal family history. If you don't know it, start finding out about it. It's part of who you are. The good, the bad, the ugly. I always end by saying vote, vote, vote. Our voting rights are being eroded. Remember, it was the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. That is being taken away. And it was specifically talking about them being able to vote. I say them because women were not included, because women couldn't vote then. When we see our voting right, there was the Civil Rights Act of 1865 and the one of 1885 and the Civil Rights Act of 1965, all, both designed to give more freedoms and to African Americans, to the formerly enslaved, descendants of the formerly enslaved. Those are being eroded. So we need to vote and vote and vote until change comes. I am Bronwyn Lucas, your host, and I want to thank you for joining in tonight. Hopefully, you learned a little something new. I am Bronwyn, the Caring Counselor, here to help you become a better you. How does this impact our mental health? Oh, yeah, being Black in America impacts our mental health every day. Just because we can wake up and because we have melanin, we're treated differently. So, join me next week as we talk about more things that impact our mental, physical, and well being. Thanks for joining and share this on your page. Bye now.